This is lecture number DR013US07. This is the 13th of the Mega Genius lectures and the 7th lecture of the Uncommon Sense series. It was recorded on November 16th, 2000. The title of this lecture is Money and How to Get It. It is 27 minutes long. Copyright 2000 by Mega Genius. All rights reserved. This lecture is protected by internationally valid copyright. It may not, in whole or in part, be duplicated, transmitted, or otherwise reproduced without the express permission of Mega Genius. Unauthorized translation, importation, or distribution is a violation of applicable laws. Mega Genius is a United States federally registered trademark and service mark. And now, here is Mega Genius.
I know a few billionaires personally, and I know how they think. They think differently than others. For example, the late H.L. Hunt, one of the wealthiest persons on earth, was once asked point blank, "Just how much money do you really have?" Hunt thought for a few seconds and replied, "Oh, I don't know. If you know how much money you've got, you haven't got very much." Unquote. Actually, just as an aside, that reminds me, the next time I run into some illogical person who claims to have a high IQ, I must remember to remind him that if his IQ is measurable, he isn't all that bright. Well, regardless of whether you know how much money you have got, and apart from your considerations about the amount, you should know what it is and how to get it, keep it, and increase it, until you choose to spend it. Money is a symbol for energy, the capacity for doing work. For example, 5-year-olds Tommy and Frankie negotiate a deal. Tommy agrees to help Frankie with his task of picking up the fallen acorns on a lawn. In return, Frankie agrees to give Tommy a choice dead rat. Now a contract exists between the two boys, and Rodney, the dead rat, is the money. Tommy can gain it by exerting energy, and later he can use it to buy something he wants, or to pay off a debt, at least to anyone else who agrees that the dead rat is money. How does Tommy obtain more dead rats, and how many more can he accumulate? Well, he has to put forth more energy, either in sufficient quantity or quality, or create, find, or otherwise obtain items that others consider to be of value and for which they will trade more dead rats. That's all. He does not even necessarily have to work hard to become wealthy. If he can just communicate in some manner that helps others to survive, or at least makes them think they can survive better, he can get more dead rats for doing it. Accordingly, if he does it well enough or long enough, one day he will have stockpiled so many dead rats that he will no longer know how many he has either. Anything that people agree to accept as a medium of exchange is money. You could use tufts of elephant bristles, or seashells, or diamonds, salt, or anything, as long as the people with whom you bargain agree to accept the symbol. In fact, some of the larger denominations of stone currency on the Pacific island of Yap stand 12 feet high and weigh more than a ton. Believe me, to those islanders, that's real money. Now, in order for any substance to be broadly and continuously accepted as money, however, it should be scarce, durable, and easily divisible. Scarce so that it does not become so commonplace as to no longer be considered valuable. Durable so that it does not evaporate, rust, or rot away. Easily divisible so that it can be conveniently separated into precise amounts as the need arises. Is there any substance that fits these criteria above all others on earth? Well, silver comes close, and has been used freely as money for centuries, but gold is nearly perfect. It is quite scarce, almost eternally durable, and remarkably divisible and unifiable. It is also quickly recognized, easily transported, of uniform composition, and generally considered incomparably more aesthetic than the late Rodney Rodent. Anything, anytime, any place. If it is for sale, it can be bought with gold. Now, most individuals do not own much gold. Does that mean they do not have much money? Not necessarily, but it does mean that to the degree that they accept a substitute for gold, they assume risk. Let's look at this for a moment. Anyone who grew up in the United States in the early 1930s or before probably remembers plunking down gold coins on counters to buy goods and services. There was not the slightest doubt in anyone's mind that gold was money. Then, in 1933, on the advice of some of the supposedly best economists, the government renounced the gold standard. In other words, even though the government knew that gold best served the purposes of real money, it decided to pretend that it didn't. So, United States citizens were required by law to surrender their gold to the government, who else, in exchange for silver certificates made of paper. Now, that was not the first time paper money had been issued in the country. Originally, the colonists had known that paper money tended to decrease in value. Therefore, the early United States government had decided to mint only coins. Nevertheless, 86 years later, in the midst of the costly American Civil War, Congress approved the issue of paper greenbacks to supplement the gold and silver that was in circulation. The significance of the government renouncing the gold standard in 1933, some 70 years later, was that for the first time in the country's history, it became illegal for citizens to own and use the real thing. United States money was no longer as good as gold. The only reason people accepted the paper currency was that it was redeemable for silver, and they knew that silver was the next best money to gold. Now, the paper currency was not silver, mind you, but printed right on the face of every silver certificate was the solemn promise of the government of the United States of America that it would exchange the dollar bill for real silver at various locations throughout the country. Besides, silver certificates were also easily exchangeable for silver coins, which were in broad circulation. The next step away from the possession of actual money occurred some 30 years later, in the mid-1960s, when the government decided to renounce the silver standard. This time it was not necessary to make it illegal to own silver. Instead, the move was subtle. First, the government rapidly removed from circulation all denominations of coins that contained any appreciable amounts of silver, and replaced them with coins of silver-clad copper that appeared almost identical. Although copper is a far cry from gold, or even silver, it has been used as a substitute form of money since ancient times, and has at least traditionally rated above iron, lead, cattle, corn, eggs, tobacco, beaver skins, and of course, dead rats. The word chutzpah, of Yiddish derivation, has come to mean nerve or gall, but that's not an accurate translation. It's more extreme. Someone once explained it this way: for a child to cold-bloodedly murder both of his parents would reflect plenty of nerve or gall, but if he then begged for mercy from the court because he was an orphan, that's chutzpah. One of the more memorable examples of chutzpah in modern times occurred concurrently with the decision to replace the citizens' silver coinage with mere copper. The United States government openly reneged on its promise to people throughout the world to redeem silver certificates for silver. It did not matter what was promised in writing on the faces of the dollars. The government just decided that after a brief period of warning, it would break its word. And it did. Thereafter, both the silver certificates and the newly printed dollars were only exchangeable for copper, other inconsequential metals, and more paper. Accordingly, the subsequent dollar was no longer called a silver certificate. Rather, at our current stage of the devaluation process, it's known as a Federal Reserve note, printed by the government and issued by a dozen Federal Reserve banks. Its alleged value is backed by a pledge of collateral. Another promise. Is it money? Well, it certainly does not have all the essential characteristics of the real thing, and so it is not. But it will serve as a fairly workable substitute as long, and only as long, as people are generally willing to accept it as at least a flimsy imitation of the real McCoy. Why would any country want to force its citizens to give up real money and accept an imaginary and risky paper substitute? It would seem there would have to be something in it for the government, especially since many of the world's governments have done it. It could be done with malicious intent, and probably has been, although that usually is not the case and was not the reason it happened in the United States. But the actual reason becomes apparent when we compare the basic monetary characteristics of gold with paper currency. Is paper currency divisible? Not really, but since a dollar can easily be exchanged for 100 cents, the effect is similar. Is paper currency durable? Not particularly, since the average lifespan of a dollar is only about 18 months. However, the government continually prints replacements. Well then, is paper currency scarce? It might seem as though it is from your viewpoint of how much more you wish you had, but it's really only as scarce or abundant as the government decides to slow or accelerate its printing presses. Therefore, from the government's point of view, paper money is not scarce at all. Every 1,000 bills costs only about $20 to print, regardless of the denomination. After all, they are only paper and ink. You see, there is only so much gold in the world that has been discovered and refined, and that amount increases by a very small percentage annually. When you consider the quantities of the mineral used for dentistry, jewelry, and other industrial purposes, and the amounts recycled, the total gold in existence is substantially stable. No one knows how to throw a switch on a machine and create more. Conversely, the creation of paper money is just that easy. A government decides there should be more of it, rolls the printing presses, and there it is, in ever-increasing quantities, as long as the machines are stocked with paper and ink. You could consider it a type of legal counterfeiting, which governments prefer to call increasing the money supply, in accordance with public relations. Governments do not like to have to explain why they do this, at least in language most citizens can understand. But if strongly pressed for a comprehensible answer, they will usually justify the act by contending that if they did not continually increase the amount of currency in circulation, most individuals' incomes would seldom increase. And they are right. When a country is truly on the gold standard, citizens, on the whole, are paid fair prices for their services rendered and products produced. So, regardless of how much Joe Lackluster insists that he must have automatic annual salary increases, as long as the gold supply does not markedly increase, the extra money does not exist to give to him. Instead, salary increases are given to workers who have proved themselves through additional education, experience, or genius to be of substantially increasing value to their employers. The more a citizen produces, the more he is rewarded for it. Sounds like a novel idea, doesn't it? On the paper standard, since there is more currency in circulation each year, Joe Lackluster can usually keep getting some small part of the increased amount, and thereby at least feel, erroneously think, that he is getting ahead. It has been said that a continual increase in the money supply tends to keep all the Joes and Janes happy with their increasing incomes, so they are less likely to be critical of the economy, and especially the politicians whose duty it is to manage it. In brief, it placates the masses, thereby helping incumbents to be re-elected. That's what governments will usually admit, reluctantly. Now, let's look at what they hate to admit. On the paper standard, there is so much more money floating about that most workers begin to expect automatic salary increases, whether their value to their employers has increased or not. Furthermore, since most workers are appeased by getting to pocket some of the increased money supply every so often, employers feel less obligation to reward production proportionately. That is to say that since the better workers are already somewhat placated by their automatic annual salary increases, those who should be rewarded the least are frequently rewarded the most due to favoritism, and that can lead to trouble. For to the degree that one does not reward production, or does reward non-production, services and products do not get produced. Something else governments hate to admit is that an increase in the money supply not only results in higher personal incomes, but higher prices too. You see, basically, except for catastrophes that result in frozen orange crops or infected cattle feed and the like, an increase in the money supply is the only way prices appreciably rise. If there is not more money available to pay higher prices, there is no use trying to raise prices to get money that is not there. Be sure you get this point. Prices do not rise because people clamor for higher salaries. That's just a distraction to keep you from seeing what's really happening. Prices rise for the most part because the money supply has been increased, resulting in more available money in circulation, which is then gobbled up through increased prices. If no one raised the prices for their goods and services, how would they get any of the new money? And so they ask for it. And since it's available, they get it. It is not true that people are unhappy in a society in which neither salaries nor prices rise automatically. It is not true at all. Instead, everyone knows that to live better he must produce more, and that he will be rewarded accordingly. In fact, one's standard of living becomes quite predictable, which promotes happiness. Meanwhile, the price of a widget next year will be essentially the same as last year, which results in even more predictability. That's good. People feel more secure, have greater confidence in the future, and economics becomes an understandable subject to the citizens if a government wants them to know what is really going on. Now, what we have been talking about, of course, is inflation, which is defined as an increase in the money supply resulting in a substantial and continual rise in the general price level, unquote. That's all inflation is. The government prints extra money, so prices go up. If inflation is not conducive to a productive society, and if it results in unpredictability, insecurity, and a lack of confidence among all who use the currency, and if the justification for the act deteriorates in the light of reason, what would motivate a government to perpetrate such a questionably patriotic deed upon its citizens? The answer is that the government desperately wants to spend more money than it has, and so, instead of continually and overtly increasing taxes, upsetting the citizens, it attempts to solve the problem covertly by simply printing more currency. In the United States, for example, there was no federal income tax before 1913. None at all. For 137 years, it was not considered necessary, and the federal government functioned just fine. When the matter of a federal income tax was seriously contemplated, Congress considered imposing a ceiling on federal income tax of 10%, so no one would mistakenly think that the new form of raising revenue might one day rise beyond reason. But in the end, the proposal was shelved on the basis that the limitation might be construed by citizens to mean that the tax might eventually rise to that indefensibly high figure of 10%. Of course, the result was a rapid rise to as much as 50%, plus a multitude of other taxes. Incidentally, only about 1 out of every 10 United States citizens paid any federal income tax prior to the Second World War. Now, every time a government inflates, there is more currency floating about. It is not as scarce. So, all of that type of currency is suddenly worth less. A dollar will not buy tomorrow what it did yesterday. The immediate effect is the same as if the government reached into your pocket and the pocket of every other citizen and absconded with some hard-earned dollars. Of course, the government might prefer to call it revenue enhancement, since the act clearly does enhance its revenue, but it is really just a devious taxation, covertly and immediately effected upon every citizen without his or her consent. Inflating the money supply is like stealing from a cookie jar. After you have justified raiding it once, it keeps getting easier and easier. Finally, you realize you are on the brink of a complete loss of control. As inflation increases, finally the government finds that the printing presses have taken on a life of their own, like a speeding car out of control. An imprecise application of the brakes may cause the vehicle to dangerously fishtail. Greater braking may cause noticeable injury to the occupants as the car skids or even rolls into the ditch. Conversely, increased speed only delays the inevitable, while increasing the likelihood of a fatal finale. In the case of continuous inflation, a minor slowing of the presses can cause a period of reduced economic activity, known as a recession. A more substantial slowdown can result in a depression. Conversely, further acceleration of the presses is the road to runaway inflation, the worst scenario of all. In a condition of runaway inflation, prices begin to rise with shocking rapidity, often overnight. Then even a slight decrease in the production of currency is likely to send an economy reeling into the depths of a severe depression. If the situation is not resolved promptly, the citizenry finds that even items like milk and bread can be bought only with bushel baskets and wheelbarrows full of the devalued currency. Almost immediately thereafter, rioting erupts, and looting becomes commonplace as a means of obtaining food and other necessities. Money is utterly worthless, so people use it to paper their walls and the like, as they do nowadays in various countries from time to time. The illusion that was created from paper by the government has collapsed under its own inflated weight, and the culture seeks to return to the most reliable money mankind has ever known, gold. Now a citizen knows his government is dancing the Highland fling on a pinhead between a depression and runaway inflation when economists begin talking about inflationary spirals, inflationary recessions, and new economic rules. How they wish they had some. And when they coin euphemisms such as stagflation to talk about the horrendous predicament without scaring the socks off all the working men and women who trust their government to do what is best. Before that, you know the problem will surface eventually when a government begins to run up a significant national debt, when prices are much higher than they were a couple of years before, and when you begin to wonder if earning more is worth the increased taxation. And sometime before that, you know you are in for a long haul down a rugged road on the day your government decides it should have your good-as-gold coins, not you. Briefly, a government that does not have enough money to live as high on the hog as it would like and does not know how to live within its budget takes away your real money, gives you a temporarily workable, but essentially worthless, substitute, and then manufactures it as though there were no tomorrow. Because money seems exceedingly plentiful, the government grows and grows and becomes obese. But tomorrow does come. Then the government clutches its breeches that are bursting at the seams, blames its citizenry for demanding higher wages, or some similar poppycock, begs its economists to do something magical, and prays to high heaven that the whole sour economy doesn't putrefy all over its bib. Politicians never seem to learn there is no free lunch. Now, just as it is possible for an expert driver to bring a careening vehicle under control, so can a leader with sufficient intelligence and power rein an inflation-infected economy before it's too late. But it is not easy. Never make the mistake of believing there are long-term rainbows on the horizon as long as the country is still on the paper standard, regardless of what government economists allege. It is just not so. Some economists may accuse me of being simplistic. I accuse those economists and their ilk of misunderstanding the meaning of the word economy. It means frugality in expenditures, and of a failure to be efficient, prudent, and thrifty. Government economists should be experts in the frugality of expenditures, but too many are not. That's the reason any government begins the deceptive act of inflating the money supply. I imagine that the late United States President Harry S. Truman had something on this order in mind when he observed, quote, "If you laid all the economists end to end, they would still point in the wrong direction," unquote. And I suspect he was deep in the frustration of trying to pin them to a reliable answer when he retorted, quote, "I wish to God I could find a good one-handed economist," unquote. Well, thus far, we know that the money on this planet that is most real is gold. We know that the standard method of getting it is to provide a service or produce a product that others consider valuable. We know that money substitutes usually shrink after you've managed to get them because politicians don't have the intelligence to discipline themselves to live within budgets. Now, it's also important to know how to invest your money for financial return. After all, if you are not earning more with it than inflation is eroding from it, you could work all your life and still die in the poorhouse. In the next lecture, we will use the Genius Formula to glimpse into the future. Identify the most important thing you can know about money, and determine the wisest investment of all.